Hello, my name is Lesley Atherton and this is my story, Captain366. The weather was worsening and Captain366 was monitoring it with some interest. Responsible and upright, as a citizen he was admired by most others in the captain's citizenry as a shining example of those standards which must be upheld by the remainder of the captain designated. The skies were crystal clear and grey as usual, but something was definitely amiss. Captain366 was high above the city, teetering on a disc-like extension of the captain citizenry domain. The domain was breathtakingly high up, but he didn't feel it, as he was well accustomed to it by now. From Captain366's viewpoint on the disc, he was honoured to monitor the weather, to control the climate, and to do the same with the lower designations of the citizenry. His small, strengthened pod enabled him to zip around the city at short notice, examining problems and keeping a check on things. He was only one of many thousands doing the same essential task, but he took his duties particularly seriously. Captain366, this is Captain553, came a voice from nowhere. Go on, replied Captain366. His eyes showed no interest. He was still looking into the sparkling grey sky. Something didn't seem right. Area BBB, said Captain553. Captain366 remained in the pod and repeated his colleague's words. Area BBB. The pod took him there. As he hovered, he could see that Area BBB was in trouble. Many others of the captain's citizenry were hovering too, all seemingly unsure of how to progress. The cages containing the criminals were in the open, constructed hastily on City Street, which used to be home only to traffic and pedestrians. The cages were exposed to the elements at all times. Casualties were high, fatalities common. In the cages, Captain366 heard the cries of the unwanted, the people nobody wanted. They were too demeaned to be responsibles, but a little higher class than the unnecessaries. They were tip-pickers, who, though vital, were also disgusting and the lowest of the low. Those caged unwanteds were the criminal class, but in so many ways the unnecessaries had the worst designation. They were the unhelpable, the unstoppable and the unbearable. They took to life in the cages with anger and indignation, but also with acceptance. The unwanteds, however, were the petty criminals, those who owed money and told lies and sold things which weren't theirs to sell and left without paying. They were the ones who caused problems. They were self-righteous and indignant. How dare they be incarcerated? How dare they be in this position? Captain366 watched and counted. The lockups were safe enough. Numbers in Area BBB were stable. No fatalities today. No injuries as far as he could tell. He conferred with fellow captains. They confirmed this. None could understand why they had been called. And then Captain366 and all the others heard the sound they'd been dreading. Or rather, they didn't hear it. The sound they heard was the complete cessation of sound. The slowing down of the pulse of the city, the quietening of the unwanteds, the eyes upwards expressions full of fear. The city was still. The pods hovered expectantly. The captains awaited instruction, though they all knew what the usual instruction would be. They waited, the silence oppressed. Remove yourselves, came the voice. Unexpected. They looked at each other, hovering with a static calm which belied their fear. What? Captain366 whispered. What does that mean? I think we have to go, said Captain231, equally quietly. She was older, more experienced, and less inclined towards irrational fear than were many of her fellows. Where? Seemed to be the question on the lips of all the captains. Nobody knew. Remove yourselves, came the repeated instruction. Penalties for non-removal are lock-up and removal of designated captain status. Remove yourselves and await further instruction. Captain366 and other designates who had been pointlessly called to this site needed no further instruction. A quiet verbal instruction to the pods, they all immediately removed themselves back to where their mission had begun. But even from Captain366's location, some many distances away, the sounds from Area BBB could be heard. His eyes were squinting, and he was pressing his hands against his temples and fingers into his ears to block out the screaming, and nostrils squished to block out the stench of mass burning. It wasn't the first time that the unwanteds had been removed in that way. It had happened more frequently recently, though, and this was the very first time that any of the captains had actually been present. It was worrying in the extreme. Suddenly released from the pod, Captain366 was now free to relax and recharge batteries within stringent guidelines. What would he do? Outside of pod life, Captain366 was usually referred to as Jim or Carter, he being in possession of both those names. But pod life was strict. He knew what he shouldn't do, but he knew he was going to do it. The temptation to check out Area BBB was too tempting. He wouldn't be human if he wasn't curious. Surely it wouldn't do any harm. So, decision made, he knew that taking a risk and walking the streets was the only way that he was likely to not be noticed. The atmosphere at ground level was turgid, smoky and unhealthy. One of the many reasons why the unwanteds didn't last long once encaged, though of course their regular annihilation by burning didn't help. Jim hoped he wouldn't meet anyone, but it was only 3 or 4 of the city streets away. He was sure he wouldn't. The only other members of the Captain Designate who were on the streets tonight would be the fellow curious sightseers, and all were in equal danger, equally unlikely to tell on each other. Still, Jim took no chances. Once on the street, he walked quickly, head down, alone and feeling it, but that wasn't unusual. Everyone felt alone. They had been tutored at school about the inevitability of this unchanging, universal human condition. But Jim wasn't so sure that it had always been so. His mother, who he'd had access to till the age of 10, when they were separated as per the citizenship rules, was loving and had treated him with respect. She told him so much about how life used to be. And now, as Jim wandered cold and coughing through the litter-strewn streets of his city, he once again wondered if the tales his mother had told him were true, that back in the old archaic times it had been allowed and even encouraged to understand and get to know people, to have what was known as friendships or loyalty to anything other than the state, and to fall in irrational, ridiculous love. Of course, Jim knew no different now. Life, since the loss of his mother, had been cold. He lost concentration for a moment and almost stumbled. Just a short distance away, picking through the street's debris, were 6 unnecessaries, some only as young as he'd been when he lost his mother to the citizenry. They were collecting what they could find. Vicious, hoarding, intense, dirty and smelly they were. They knew no better and couldn't be trusted, but were the underclass and thus were ignored by everyone above them, even the unwanteds. A small, dark, unnecessary, with face so covered with dirt that it was impossible to tell if it was all dirt or if some of it was colouring, looked at Jim with the inquisitive interest that was usual to unnecessaries. Jim knew his orders. His life and his customs told him to simply ignore and walk away. This creature, however, was staring. It was staring right through him. It said, "Area BBB, you going?" A simpler phrase as could be imagined, but Jim froze to the spot, unable and unwilling to answer. "Going?" came the small voice. No civility or hostility within, just a curious interest. Jim hurried on. Unnecessaries worried him, as they did most captains, which was why they spent such a tiny proportion of their lives on the ground. They were untrustable, genderless, nameless, useless, other than as garbage pickers. But then, against all custom and against all recommendation, the unnecessary pulled at his clothing. Jim was dressed in his usual evening uniform of yellow, the only other clothing he was permitted to own. The unnecessary's hand was dirty. The yellow-stained fabric was as a beacon to those above him, Captain Moonlight especially. He was a shadowy figure, perhaps even more than one individual person, whose darkness exploits kept control in the city's streets. He was called Captain Moonlight after a mythical Irish figure from the 19th century, whatever mythical Irish and 19th century were. Jim's mum had told him about it. She was an educated woman. She knew about life and the world before this world came to be, and she understood that Captain Moonlight inspired only dread. Moonlight equalled slaughter, just as daylight equalled persecution, enforced order and bubbling under chaos. It was the job of the captains to control that bubbling chaos. All emotions suppressed, other than the desire for loyalty and duty to the state, Jim's first response was to push the unnecessary away and to shout at the messing of his precious clothing. But when he tried to shout, no sound happened. The unnecessary's eyes were red and clouded and likely disease-ridden. Jim wondered if it was usual, but had no idea what to do. He allowed the unnecessary to keep holding him. He didn't shout. He didn't hurt. He didn't push away. But the decision about what to do was made for him. Within seconds, the unnecessary was surrounded by night shift captain designates. Jim recognised them, but knew no names. The unnecessary was removed, no doubt to a special lock-up. Jim should have been relieved, but he actually felt something else. He felt what his mum would have called pity. She would have felt it, and much more. She'd been a political radical, and Jim found out on his 11th birthday that she had been jailed for non-compliance with the norms of the society. She had told him that their society was a dictatorship and that she was fighting for the old ideal of democracy. He'd asked what the word meant, and she said she was unable to tell him as it wasn't written anywhere. There were no books or other records in this society, and that no citizen could speak of ideas that had been passed through the ages without written records. There would be no point in written records anyway, as nobody alive could have decoded them. Only a very few people, those in the prime personary maybe, would have known what such ancient scribblings would mean. One time, Jim and another captain were summoned to a ground-level place, later called a cellar, and they found words everywhere. The graphical images meant nothing to him, but he wondered if his mum might have understood. She'd often said that a world without recordings of its culture was doomed to misery, and Jim hadn't been sure what she meant. But looking at the face of the young unnecessary as it was surrounded, he thought he began to understand. Jim had changed. It had been a slow process, but it had undoubtedly occurred. It was as if he could put himself in the shoes of others and feel how they felt. His mum would have understood, and she would probably even have a name for it. But Jim had no name. He decided to call it Care, just in his own head, to help him understand. It worked. Today he'd felt care when he'd been touched by the nameless and sexless unnecessary. That child had a mother, he was sure of it, as unnecessary children came into being just as others did. It wasn't their fault that they were born that way. The realisation hit him strongly. They were born that way, and they weren't bad or wrong or living transgressions of some norm. They had been born into their poor, miserable lives as unnecessaries, and they were stuck with it. He thought of that young child, and how its mother might be worried. Perhaps unnecessaries were immune to such care and concern, but Jim thought not. Just because they subsisted on homemade potato liquor, it doubtless made the awful existence a little more acceptable. And just because they dressed in rags rather than uniforms, where would they get the uniforms anyway, scavenging on heaps? It didn't mean that he had the power or the right to disregard them. Of course they were hoarders. They had to make the most of what they could find. Of course they were dirty and smelly, for where would they clean themselves? Of course they were thieves, because they were legally prevented from gaining employment. Jim realised it now in a flash. The unnecessaries had been created by the society they lived in, that he lived in. The care was coming to him now more strongly. And what about the violent and criminal unwanteds? Was it their destiny to be so? Were they in fact a social construct, just as the unnecessaries were? Was he, in his Captain366 uniform, a socially engineered construct too? And where did all these ideas keep coming from? He'd never thought this way before. He knew that thought was pointless, and that the only law was the right law, and that those who transgressed would be punished. But what about the unnecessary? He couldn't be bothered with the others now. He just wanted to think about that one. What would happen to it? And the care thing kicked in again. Jim couldn't believe that it had taken him this long in life to even question what happened to those who were taken away. He made a call. Captain366 here. He was direct and to the point. In Zone B4 at around 16:55 yesterday, an unnecessary was apprehended. A youth. Where is it now? The voice on the other end of the communications didn't care why Captain366 required this information. It was her job to disseminate it to him. Lock-up 18, she replied, situated also in Zone B4. Jim immediately made his way. As he stood in front of the window to a room crammed with unnecessaries, he was struck at the incongruousness of their clothes within such a sterile and clean room. He was also struck that these people were not fighting, hurting and arguing, as he'd been led to believe they always did, whether in or out of custody. They were sitting around the edges of the large room, most in little groups. They were talking, some animatedly. "They're waiting for their meal," the guard informed Captain366. "What are they allotted to eat?" he asked. He was curious. "Same as us," replied the guard, "but we mash it up. They haven't many teeth, and it's what they're used to." "I want to go in to find the unnecessary who was apprehended in my presence earlier today." Captain366 was the superior officer, only just, so the guard couldn't stop him, but he didn't advise it. "We don't go in," he said, simply. "So how does it keep from descending into chaos? How is it so clean? There must be about 50 unnecessaries in there." "They do it themselves." Despite himself, the guard looked respectful. "They aren't that bad when you get to know them. Well, most of them aren't, anyway." The guard straightened up. "I want to go in," repeated Jim. The door was opened. As Jim stepped in, he'd expected some kind of clamour, but he was left alone and disregarded by most of the unnecessaries. He wondered how long they'd been in here, whether their loved ones knew they were here, and what would happen to them. There it was, that care thing again. It seemed to be infecting him, and he was powerless to stop it. But he didn't want to stop it. He listened to it, just as he'd listened to his mum. He walked slowly round the edges of the room, moving respectfully, when a group of unnecessaries were extended out into his pathway. A few looked at him, their eyes dark and without emotion. And then he saw the child and suddenly knew it was a male. The boy walked over. "I know you. What are you doing?" the boy asked. "I've come to see you." "I didn't steal anything from you." "I know." An unsure pause. "What do you want, then?" He was confident and undoubtedly insightful, this young lad, but it was entirely outside of his existence that a captain should be interested in him, other than for incarceration purposes. Jim was uneasy too. He didn't understand himself anymore. He seemed to be running on compulsion. "Is this your first time here?" Jim asked hesitantly. "It's everyone's first time," the unnecessary replied. "Once you're in forever." Jim noticed that he said it without regret. They were an accepting lot, the unnecessaries, tolerant and quite gentle too. Jim was starting to experience something a little like respect for them. He thought that was what it was. His mum would have known. "Nobody gets out?" "Not ever." "What happens?" Jim asked. "We stay here till they take us away." "Where do they take you?" "I don't know." "Are you scared?" The question had left Jim's lips before he realised it. He asked it again. "Are you scared?" "I don't know what that means," the boy replied. "I'm here in this room till they take me away." "Do you have family or friends?" Another blank expression. "I don't know what that means." "People special to you," Jim tried to explain. "Some," the boy replied, "but they come and go a lot. Mostly go." "What's your name?" Jim asked. "I'm Bruce." Jim knew the name Bruce. He remembered a child he'd used to spend time with. It was interesting that the unnecessaries used the same names as the captain class. "Do you want to get out, Bruce?" "There's no point thinking about it. I never will." "What if I could get you out?" "That would be fine," said Bruce, "if you can. I've got nothing to lose." And Jim knew it. Bruce had nothing to lose, whether he lived or died, and whether he stayed or left. Life held difficulties either way. Life held insurmountable challenges too, and the inevitability of an unnecessary defeat was incontrovertible. Jim began to walk away, wishing he was stronger and had developed more care before coming here. He wished his mother was there to guide him. He wished that Bruce had shown more of a sign of something, but he hadn't. He'd been cold and distant, and it was nothing personal. It was just the way things were. Just as Jim was Captain366. Just as his mum had been imprisoned for her dangerous beliefs, just as the unwanteds were criminals at heart, and the unnecessaries were unhelpable, unstoppable, and unbearable. Jim no longer felt like Jim. He felt like Captain366. He reached the perimeter edge and knocked for the guard to release him. No unnecessary clamoured for escape around him. He was inconsequential. "I'd keep an eye on them," said Jim. "I feel something brewing." "It's the youngsters." "Will do," said the guard. And Captain366 left the compound feeling satisfied that, though the world could not be changed, it could be a lot worse. Captain366 straightened his shoulders. Care was all very well, but it didn't keep the society's cogs turning. He and his class did that. Proud of what he had learned that day, Captain366 returned to his home and to a deep, untroubled sleep.